great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker from IPFW, Bernd Fischer, a very well-known and very respected member of the IPFW faculty. Bernd's been chair of history as long as I can remember, and I've been here 16 years. He is the preeminent Balkan scholar, and as you can read about him, he's been interviewed numerous times by national and international media. He served as a consultant to the State Department on a number of things, and has published a number of wonderful books, and he's going to speak to us tonight about Balkan dictators, or Albanian dictators. Have we seen the last of them?
Great. Thank you very much. I've got all my paraphernalia. Well, thank you very much. I've got all my paraphernalia here. Let me make sure I can get it all working and in order. Welcome, welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. Certainly, there is no greater recognition than that of one's colleagues, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you this evening. The topic tonight, as I suspect probably you already know, has something to do with the Balkans and Albania. The Balkan Peninsula, which of course includes Albania, as we see. I do have an audio-visual extravaganza for you too, as you can see. Has a reputation, and has had, I think, for some centuries of violence and instability. We've all heard of the Balkan Peninsula essentially being the powder keg of Europe, being responsible for World War I. More recently, we've heard of centuries of ethnic hatred. This was a theme that became prominent during the Clinton administration, and I think was in part responsible for a slow response in the 90s to a crisis there. Winston Churchill, in his usual colorful manner, suggested that the Balkan Peninsula has produced more history than it can consume locally, which I think is probably true to at least to a certain extent. There also, of course, seems to be a widely held impression that the Balkan Peninsula has a special penchant for political authoritarianism. And certainly in recent centuries, the Balkan Peninsula has experienced more than its share of strongmen, from kings to communist-era tyrants to nationalist demagogues. And pessimists, even today, at least to a certain extent, still suggest that we've not seen the last of the likes of people like Slobodan Milosevic and Nicolae Ceausescu and Hoxha, who we'll talk a little bit more about today. These pessimists suggest that their political style is so thoroughly ingrained in the Balkans that it's difficult, if not impossible, to essentially remove it, and that their successors are essentially right around the corner and will soon drag the peninsula back into political darkness. Well, I'd like to deal with this question a little bit today and examine it in the context of Albanian leaders, Albanian strongmen, if you will, and talk about some of my personal favorites. King Zog, who ruled during the interwar period and was finally removed by Mussolini in 1939. Enver Hoxha, who was the communist-era dictator who ruled from 1945 all the way until his death until 1985. And the current Prime Minister, Sali Berisha, who would probably not appreciate being included in this group, but we'll talk about him anyway. Any discussion of this issue, it seems to me, must be seen in the context of history, which in this case will help us, or perhaps will help us do a number of things. One, it will help us determine, I think, the causes of the phenomenon of Albanian and to a certain extent Balkan strongmen. Secondly, I think it'll help us to understand why this era lasted so long, and to a certain extent why it is still with us today. And finally, it'll help us to, I think, deal with this issue of whether authoritarianism really is sort of a cultural inevitability in the Balkans or not. Well, let's start with sort of a brief, very brief overview of 20th century Balkan history then. In the post-World War I period, much of Europe, of course, began the new era in the midst of a great deal of hope. After all, the old sort of illiberal ruling class had been removed by the war and replaced by extended suffrage. Women were able to vote almost everywhere, except for Switzerland, which didn't allow women the right to vote until the 70s, but that's another issue. We'll talk about that later. Elements of populist democracy were introduced throughout the peninsula and indeed throughout Europe. New political parties were developed which came up with seemingly clear programs that generally included the establishment of full democracy, generally included the establishment of a market economy, ethnic inclusiveness, lots of early hope in the 1920s. Much of this early hope, however, was dashed as old and new political, social, economic problems proved essentially to be more enduring than the promise of the new age. And these difficulties essentially allowed ambitious leaders with a new narrative to emerge. They basically sort of represented themselves as saviors to the people, saviors to the nation, and saviors to the state. And they often, of course, were able to enlist the support of the military, and they were also helped by using popular fears of the other. In other words, establishing some context of extreme nationalism. And they ultimately were able, throughout the course of the 1930s, to basically sort of push the Balkans from some degree of sort of proto-democracy to authoritarianism, and then ultimately to some form of dictatorship. Now, the American scholar Ronald Winthrop, in a recent book on dictators, which for those of you who are keeping score is my sort of theoretical foundation here for the talk, defines several categories of dictators based upon a sort of interesting series of criteria. One is basically just sort of loyalty. The second one, repression. And for interwar strongmen, he argued, and I certainly would agree, that the strongmen really were low on both scales. In other words, low in terms of loyalty, also low in terms of repression. And the category that he coined was tin pot dictators. And I think it sort of fits to a certain extent, at least with some of the people that I'll be talking about. Now, the Albanian version of this phenomenon, in other words, sort of tin pot dictatorship, was King Zog. And here we have King Zog. I wrote a biography about him in the mists of the 1980s. An interesting individual on a whole bunch of different levels. He obviously had a real penchant for uniforms, and interestingly enough, this is Zog as king, but he had a uniform that looked almost the same when he was president, you know, with sort of gold epaulets when he was kept a lot of tailors very busy, apparently. He was the son of a minor tribal chieftain from northern Albania. He used his considerable political abilities as well as his ruthlessness to overwhelm his rivals and became first the prime minister and then very rapidly the president and then ultimately the king, and obviously there wasn't anywhere he could go from there, so he remained king until 1939. He stayed in power through coercion to a certain extent, through violence, through bribery. He borrowed large sums of money from Mussolini to keep his regime going. And these various methods of rule, of course, created serious problems for him. Albania, even today, is a state still confounded by the concept of the blood feud. And during the course of the 1930s, this was a very serious problem. And on his way up, he essentially contracted probably about 600 blood feuds. You know, so there were 600 major families basically out to do him ill. There were any number of assassination attempts. Perhaps the most famous took place actually outside of the Opera House in Vienna in 1931, where he had just seen one of Puccini's operas. He was leaving by the back door, and about 4 or 5 assassins set upon him. Apparently not very good shots, however. But Zog joined right in. I mean, he pulled a pistol out of his tuxedo and basically started blasting away. The Viennese detectives who were following him were just, of course, aghast. There's wonderful material, incidentally, in the Viennese archives about this. It goes on for yards and yards of archival space. He, after this episode, became a little bit more careful. He traveled from 32 on only with his mother or his sisters, basically because of the fact that when you are with a woman, you are essentially immune to blood feuds. So he spent a lot of time in the company of women for the rest of his life. His mother, incidentally, who lived in the villa across from him, was the only person allowed to prepare his food, and it was sent to him in a locked box across the street. Zog ended up spending most of the rest of his time sort of shut away in his overheated office, chain-smoking cigarettes, which I guess constitute the wages of blood feuds. And Mussolini, of course, ultimately also demanded something for his money, and that included first influence, and then ultimately, when Mussolini decided in 1939 that influence wasn't going to do it, he ultimately was responsible for Mussolini's ouster. Now, the evaluations of Zog vary rather widely. His wife, Geraldine, described him to me as the 20th century Napoleon, only taller, of course. Let's see, well, here is Zog, incidentally, with his family, his mother and his sisters. This is for you, Georgia. And let's see, there he is with Geraldine, who actually was half American and half Hungarian. They married in 1938. She remained queen in Albania for only about a year before Zog was thrown out. There I am, actually, with Geraldine. She, in the early 80s, invited me to spend a couple of weeks with her in her villa on the Costa del Sol in Spain. And so I conducted interviews. Lovely woman. She did have a penchant for drinking martinis in the morning, though, which I think. But quite the linguist, and someone who, of course, had a rather positive image of her husband and his political abilities. Others were perhaps not quite so kind. Victor Emmanuel of Italy, who actually became king of Albania after Zog's ouster, called him simply the better bandit, which I thought fit perhaps better than Napoleon. In any case, there certainly was a lot to be criticized in terms of Zog, particularly after he became king. He really was better at political intrigue, I think, than in terms of constructive policy. Once he became king, he became rather complacent and a little mentally sloppy. Still capable of determined and obstinate action, I would suggest, but no longer capable of thoughtful considerations of ways and means to deal with the resulting difficulties. Much of the problem, I think, was because of the fact that his regime was so thoroughly personal. And all of these regimes, as we'll see, are personal to the extent that institutions really don't make that much difference. So once the head is removed, the regime inevitably falters and then collapses. At the worst of times, Zog resembled a small-sized, extravagant, indolent, oriental potentate surrounded by hangers-on who basically sort of lived off of him and whom he really was unable to shake off. He was not a particularly good judge of character. He tended to be loyal to a fault and kept people long after they demonstrated that they were a serious detriment. People in Albania, when Zog was finally removed in 1939, still lived in grinding poverty. Probably not more than 4% of the economy was industrial. There were no railroads. There were only limited road networks. There were very few cars. Zog had a few cars. He liked cars. Hitler actually gave him a Mercedes as a wedding present, one of these supercharged Mercedes convertibles that he liked to sort of race around in. And he ultimately took it with him. When I was in London doing research on Zog in the 1970s, at one point when I got just really tired of going through economic records, I decided to try and find the car. And I found it. Zog actually took the car with him to England, but it was blown up by German bombers as it was being unloaded in Liverpool. And Zog actually put in a claim to the British government and was paid for this car. So clearly he had some economic smarts, at least in terms of when it dealt with him specifically. But in general, Albania was probably not much better off in 1939 than it had been in the 1920s. Although I would suggest that there was still some marginal achievement. Certainly Zog was responsible for limited political stability. He reduced brigandage, which was a huge problem, particularly in the north, in the highlands during the course of the 20s and the 30s. He also tended to reduce blood feuds, not his own. I mean, basically increased his own, but others. And I have always argued sort of created an environment conducive to the growth of nationalism by basically sort of reducing internal differences. And there were many, regional, religious. We'll talk a little bit more about those momentarily. So out of the chaos of tribes and feudalism, to a certain extent at least, he created a state, and he at least sort of laid the foundations. He laid the foundations for a nation. Now, in the broader sense, Zog and his Balkan contemporaries, and there certainly were many other Balkan kings during the 20s and the 30s, they did not, it seems to me, come out of, or come to power rather because of the region's innate authoritarianism, but rather came to power as a result of a series of explainable factors. One, outside influences, in particular the imperial ambitions of the Italians during the course of the 20s and the 30s. The Italians pumped in a great deal of money in order to broaden their influence. Also, at least prior to World War I, the attempt on the part of Austria-Hungary simply to survive, which was its principal foreign policy goal by the time we get to the turn of the century. We also, of course, have dramatic events, including the cataclysm of World War I, which certainly played a major role in bringing this type of authoritarianism to the Balkans. The Great Depression, which hit the Balkans particularly hard in 1929 through 1931, had a very important impact as well. And then there are also a series of fairly intractable internal problems, in particular the peasant issue. The Balkans, by the time we get to the 1920s, suffered from simply too many people working in conditions of primitive, sort of under-resourced agriculture. And this was particularly true in a place like Albania, where, despite the fact that probably in the 20s, maybe 98% of the population lived off of agricultural and animal husbandry, yet only about 9% of the land was arable. The rest of it was swampland and mountains, which did few people much good. We also have the influence of a sort of stubborn Ottoman heritage, which is, again, particularly strong in Albania. Albania remained part of the Ottoman Empire actually until 1912, and because of the fact that most Albanians are Muslims, they looked to the Ottomans for protection from the Greeks and the Turks, and declared their independence really reluctantly. Their future had been tied to the Ottomans for 400 or 500 years. We also have the example of pre-World War I leaders. I mean, Albania was led by a prince prior to World War I, so this, I think, played a role in terms of the political structure during the interwar period as well. And then, of course, all of this was sort of reinforced by the arrogance of power that made people like Zog assume that he had the answers, and indeed was the only one with the answers. Well, the Second World War, of course, swept away Zog and his family. Let me show you a couple of quick shots of his family, incidentally. This is the current king, Leka I, who doesn't have quite the political ability of his father. He spent most of his life in exile. He lives in Albania now. He was 1 day old when his family was forced to flee Albania. He grew up principally in England. He went to Sandhurst and then spent some of his life in Egypt, and then ultimately ended up in Spain with his mother. But with the death of Franco, because of the fact that Leka made his living principally by running guns, he was asked to leave and ended up in South Africa, where he was apparently allowed to continue his chosen profession. But in the 90s, when Albania, I'll talk a little bit more about this momentarily, but was in a degree of political turmoil, there was actually a referendum on returning the monarchy in 1997, and it didn't do so well. Maybe about 30% voted in favor. Leka decided to question the results of the ballot, and so this is a campaign demonstration. Leka, of course, dressed up in khaki with grenades clipped to his belt and accessorized by pearl-handled revolvers. I don't know if you can see them very well, but they're there. Not surprisingly, this political demonstration turned into a melee almost immediately, and he was forced to leave the country very quickly and remained in exile again for another 5 years until his family returned. And this is actually the Crown Prince Leka, who is a lot smarter in many respects, and me with the same jacket, incidentally. The royal family actually, I think I've mentioned this to some of you, asked me last year to serve as sort of an informal advisor. And what they're trying to do at this point is sort of reintegrate into Albania. I mean, Albania is a republic, of course. I mean, they're not going to attempt to reconstruct the monarchy, but they are getting back a lot of their property, which is happening throughout the Balkans, as you know, the communists are being divested of much of what they took during the course of their 50 years of rule. And so the family's fairly wealthy, and they're sort of looking for a role to play in the new Albania. So we're at least in discussion on that one. In any case, the Second World War, as I suggested, sort of swept Zog and his entire generation of tin pot strongmen away. It also, of course, removed their political systems, their societies, and basically sort of ushered in another generation of strongmen, all of whom functioned with constitutions, with national assemblies and elections, although, again, none were in any way limited by these institutions. Again, very personal regimes where institutions meant little or nothing. On Winthrop's scale, they tended, these post-war strongmen, to score rather high on repression and rather low on loyalty. And the term that he uses to describe them, which I think is perfectly reasonable, is simply a tyrant. In Albania, the position of tyrant was seized by Enver Hoxha, who was the wartime communist resistance leader, who, like Zog, had a very clear and very demonstrated political talent. He managed to organize the only real effective resistance movement in Albania against the Italians and the Germans. This is Hoxha during the war as a general in his own movement. He, of course, ended up as the last person standing in terms of the various resistance movements, and therefore was able to organize a regime basically sort of around himself. I mean, he, as soon as the war ended, he became prime minister and then foreign minister and then commander-in-chief and then president of the Democratic Front, which was the political organization of the Communist Party, and then, of course, head of the party. Like Zog, he had some problems delegating authority and sort of assumed that he was the only person with the answers. Now, he had to deal with pretty much the same problems, national issues, problems of economic backwardness, which clearly had plagued Zog, problems of instability, and the policy mix that he came up with was also fairly similar, but only after, of course, proper ideological justification. In other words, it had to sound like it was progressive and socialist, and this wasn't too difficult to do. But the problems were the same, the policy in many cases the same as well. Hoxha was another unique individual in many respects, complex and contradictory, personally well-read, well-traveled, cultured, and yet, on the other hand, he almost sort of delighted in his own brutality. He was intelligent. He certainly could not be compared with the other sort of crushingly boring gray Eastern European dictators like Ceausescu and Zhivkov, but he saw the world in completely black and white terms. He tended to sort of grossly distort events. He developed an extreme cult of the personality and extremist policies, which essentially complemented this cult of the personality. Let me just give you an example here. This is his sort of official picture. I mean, it looks very sort of Stalinist realist, doesn't it? Here he is indeed with Stalin. Hoxha basically idealized Stalin, and despite the fact that the rest of Eastern Europe and indeed the rest of the Balkans experienced, of course, rapid de-Stalinization in 1956, the Albanians never did. And my first visit there in 1988, I noticed that there were Stalinist statues everywhere. I mean, the major statue in downtown Tirana was a massive statue of Stalin. So he spent, he wrote actually a great many books, which is, they've sort of plagued me in my research, about 80 volumes altogether. But he wrote basically one book per visit with Stalin. You know, he spent like about 3 days with the guy, and a book comes out of it. Here is the extent of his cult of the personality. Huge statues. The gold one that I just showed you was the principal statue of Hoxha in downtown Tirana. I'll get back to that in a moment. So extremism, I think, was sort of the order of the day in many respects. His policies certainly have to be considered extreme. Perhaps the best example was essentially outlawing religion in 1967. He declared Albania to be the only atheist state in the world and came up with all sorts of interesting institutions to replace the religious ones, like museums of atheism. I went to go visit one of these once. Curious place. They were basically the sort of contemporary paintings of Christians repressing peasants. I'm not sure what happened to these things after the collapse of communism. Mosques and churches were all shut except for a few with historical significance, like the great Etham Bey Mosque in downtown Tirana, which I'll show you later as well. It did also have some interesting impact on the daily lives of people, including the fact that parents had to come up with new non-religious names for their children, which is, when you think about it, is really difficult to do. So lots of people were named after rivers and mountains, and some of my friends, God bless them, I'm sorry for them, have been saddled with the name Maren Glen. I think I know about 3 or 4 Maren Glens, which is basically a combination of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Maren Glen. The state that he created has been described as sort of a collage of fantasies. And actually, one of my favorite descriptions is that Albania is described as the sort of place that would make surrealists weep with joy. But certainly it was a brutal fantasy. It was a state of siege. He basically held on to power by identifying enemies, and ultimately everyone was the enemy. Certainly all the surrounding states, and of course there were the internal enemies, but the Soviet Union and the United States were at the head of the list. And this basically resulted in a level of isolation certainly unique in the world. Albania today remains scarred by the physical monuments of Hoxha's paranoia, aside from the usual command socialist architecture, which again I'll show you a couple examples of momentarily. There is socialist realist statuary like this one with graffiti now, of course, and also, and this is unique in Albania, hundreds of thousands of concrete bunkers built in the 1970s to basically sort of deter the ever-increasing list of enemies. Hoxha was always paranoid about a traditional military, and as a result, he organized a militia and trained everyone. And everyone spent time in these hundreds of thousands of bunkers. He also came up with bizarre additions to this sort of homemade self-defense system. One of my favorites is he had the young pioneers climb up to the tops of trees and sort of rope iron spikes to them, and the idea was that this would inhibit parachutists from who might have avoided the bunker system from doing damage to the country. I think I've got a couple. There's one, and there's a large one. There's me, of course, pointing to the enemy, incidentally. But these bunkers, there are massive ones for giant artillery pieces. There are small ones for like two people with a rifle. They're slowly being removed, but when I first went to Albania in the 1980s, it was almost impossible to travel for more than maybe a mile without running into these bunkers. Now, the ones that still exist, the bigger ones, one often finds have been turned into restaurants. I mean, they're very cool in the summertime, of course. Most of the smaller ones have just been turned into toilets, which is a bit of a problem, too. But the resources expended on this, as one might imagine, was just vast. I mean, we're talking about maybe 700,000 to 800,000 bunkers throughout the country. Albania had a population in the 80s of a little less than 3 million people, so it was basically one bunker for every 3 people. The previous president of Albania, who I got to know a little bit, we worked on a project together, was actually the bunker builder. He was the Deputy Minister of Defense for years during the 70s, and he would go on nostalgically about the bunkers ad nauseum, not recognizing, I think, that the rest of the planet thinks this is just a little bit odd. Hoxha's internal policies were punctuated by constant bloody purges, which impacted Albanians at all levels, from the level of the peasantry to the level of the Politburo. Again, to give you an idea, all 7 ministers of the interior under Hoxha were ultimately purged as foreign agents and shot. So this was not a position that people lined up for after a while. Hoxha's continually shrinking inner circle came down ultimately to several dozen people bound together by traditional ties of family and clan, and of course ultimately their common complicity in murderous purges. Actually about 3 weeks ago, Albania actually didn't celebrate but noted the 25th anniversary of Hoxha's death, and of course there was much television activity. A whole series of old Politburo members were sort of dug up to make comments about what it was like to be in the ruling circle and what it was like to be with Hoxha. And I watched one of these, and I think the television commentator, expected something like, well, we got to travel and we got all these great perks. And the guy just sat there for a moment and said that the one thing that he remembers was just the fear, constant every day. So no one was safe. It was insecurity from the top to the bottom. But again, like with Zog, there certainly were some achievements. I mean, Hoxha did much to bring health care to remote villages. He certainly did a good deal to emphasize education and ultimately did away with the astoundingly high illiteracy rate. I mean, illiteracy in 1939 in Albania was probably about 85 to 90%. By the time we get to the 60s, it had pretty much been eradicated. But again, these are, Albanian communist figures, so we have to take them with a little bit of salt, certainly. But most commentators suggest that with regard to illiteracy, they're at least pretty much accurate. He spent some time dealing with women's rights issues, and certainly women were much better off during the communist period, unless they were politically active, than they had been in the pre-war period. Cultural activities grew rather significantly, although again it was sort of communist cultural activities like Chinese operas were often performed in Albania. I saw one of them once. There, increased standard of living, again, a reduction of divisive factors in society, which included regional loyalties. Albania has lots of internal divisions. There are two basic sort of ethnic groups, the Gegs in the north and the Tosk in the south, but even within these two major groups, there are minor groups. So lots of regional divisions, again, the traditional north-south division, and four basic religious groups. Religion, of course, didn't play much of a role during the communist period, but it does again. The four religious groups are essentially two principal Muslim groups. They're Sunni and Bektashi, and then a smaller minority of Orthodox in the south and Catholics in the north. All of this, however, all of these achievements were, I would argue, to a certain extent offset by rigid ideological conformity, by the extreme isolation that these policies resulted in, and by the horrific legacy of terror, which will remain, I think, with Hoxha. Hoxha's successor, one of the smarter members of the Politburo, Ramazalia, laid him to rest when he died in 1985, and actually ruled as his successor until 1992. When he buried Hoxha, he basically neglected, or actually purposely didn't put a date on his tomb, arguing that such a man could never die, which unfortunately I think to a certain extent is true in Albania. It is still today profoundly scarred psychologically, I think, by his political and social legacy, all of which has made Albania's transition from command socialism to, again, a market-oriented democracy probably the most difficult in all of Eastern Europe. But once again, as with earlier generations of strongmen, his regime, and I would argue the regimes of his Balkan contemporaries, were facilitated by a combination of, one, basically cataclysmic upheaval, in this case World War II, which was responsible, of course, for basically sort of delegitimizing the political structure in the pre-war period, the social structure, the economic systems. Secondly, internal forces, of course, were still very much at play. And in the Balkans during the post-war period, it was principally the Soviet Union. But for Albania, ever paranoid of too many political alliances, the Albanians ended up with the Chinese. Initially, it was the Yugoslavs, then the Russians until the 1960s, and then the Chinese. And Hoxha, of course, liked to boast that we and the Chinese, we make 1 billion people, which is true. But there again, a good deal of exterior involvement in domestic Balkan politics. And of course, domestic conditions, as I've suggested, Hoxha dealt with a situation pretty similar to that which Zog had dealt. And then, of course, once again, the ambitions of these new saviors of the nation. They all, of course, tended to rule through fear of security services, the fear of the other, inspired by extreme nationalism. And this did perhaps develop into sort of a recyclable pattern, but it seems to me it's still rooted in explicable political circumstances and was not inevitable or natural. So, the post-communist period, has there been or will there be another generation of strongmen? Certainly the collapse of communism caused considerable dislocation, and once again foreign interests are very much at play, now mostly the European Union and the United States. But I suppose one could argue that the upheaval was perhaps not quite as great as the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the course of World War I, or either of the two 20th century world wars. Still, there has been some support for another version, perhaps sort of a strongman light version, or with apologies to Professor Winthrop, perhaps we could describe it as sort of an aluminum foil pot dictator, where the leader was expected to use his power to rapidly transition the state. And in Albania, Sali Berisha, let's see if I have Sali up here, plays that role. Oh, that's Ramazalia, incidentally. There's Sali Berisha, described as rather ardent. I don't have a picture of him with me. He doesn't like me. So, but, he was Albanian's leading cardiologist, basically a former communist, sort of a middle-level communist, really, a member, or at least a candidate member of the Central Committee, which is fairly significant. He's been described to me as actually a fairly ardent communist during the Hoxha years. One of those pictures was a picture of me with Hoxha's wife, who I've done some interviews with over the last year. I'm in the process of writing a biography of Hoxha, and she told me a wonderful story about Sali Berisha, who was Hoxha's doctor as well. She tells me that the first time that they met, Sali Berisha shook Hoxha's hand and then wandered around for like 2 days showing people the hand and basically telling them that he was never going to wash this hand. Well, he has now found anti-communism to be much more efficacious in terms of his own political career. He actually was sent during 1990 and 1991. Albania was, of course, experiencing the same difficulties that much of the rest of Eastern Europe experienced in terms of the beginning of the process of transition. And Albania faced lots of economic dislocation, student unrest. And Ramazalia, the president, basically sort of sent Sali Berisha, who was a professor at the university as well, to sort of intercede with striking students. And he very cleverly sort of took control of the democracy movement and has remained perhaps the most powerful post-communist Albanian politician ever since. He was president from 1992 to 1997, and encouraged by a conservative Albanian diaspora, principally in the United States, he attempted, much in the tradition of earlier Albanian politicians, to rule by force, by nationalism, through artificial elections, and through an authoritarian constitution. All of this, however, collapsed in 1997 amidst a pyramid investment scandal that, of course, promised wealth but ultimately led to the impoverishment of a good portion of the state. And the state in 1997 nearly disintegrated. Albania experienced probably Europe's first successful popular armed uprising since the 19th century. The populace, again, angered by the loss of their savings, raided government armories. The military simply collapsed, it went home, and the 3.2 million Albanian citizens ended up making off with about 800,000 Kalashnikov assault rifles with billions of rounds of ammunition, as well as, incidentally, heavy artillery, tanks, MiG-15 jets, which no one could get to start, which worked out well, and some fairly sophisticated Chinese surface-to-air missiles, all of which were recovered. Here are some Albanians on a tank. Not surprisingly, this resulted in chaos. Also in the death of at least hundreds, if not thousands, and almost a civil war, basically based upon this sort of north-south division. Traditionally, Sali Berisha's support came from the north, and the opposition support, the socialists who sort of came out of the Communist Party, came from the south. This was barely averted, partially as a result of the intervention of the Italians, who by this point were already dealing with tens of thousands of refugees. I mean, ultimately, probably about 1/3 of the population left between 1991 and about 1998. So hundreds of thousands of Albanians fled to Greece and to Italy, and some of them here. Well, Sali Berisha, of course, resigned in disgrace, but the successor Socialist Party ultimately was not much better, pretty much mired in corruption, and it lasted only until 2005. And in 2005, Sali Berisha was resurrected, the new Sali, we were told. And certainly he has since then been much less brutal, more democratic, although even today I would argue that democracy is incomplete and the rule of law has certainly yet to be established. Well, the remaining question is, was this sort of the last gasp of the concept of strongmen in the Balkans? It seems to me their full resurrection is inhibited by a number of factors. One, certainly the undignified end of Ceausescu in '89. Some of you may remember that, and Milosevic in 2006. There are also, I think, some positive inhibitors, including sort of the slow growth of what some NGOs call democracy factors, like press, for example, which is still, again, very problematic in Albania. Civil society, which is sort of slowly growing. The electoral process, which, despite the fact that it's still seriously flawed, is improving. The police and the courts are becoming somewhat less politicized than they were in the early 90s. And then also, all of this, I think, is strengthened by the prospect of Euro-Atlantic integration. Now, clearly, much needs to be done, and the progress that we've seen so far certainly doesn't guarantee that these strongmen are gone forever. Indeed, commentators do point to growing nostalgia for the stern, powerful figureheads of old, even if most who can be found at birthday celebrations for dead dictators tend to be retirees who've sort of fallen through the cracks, or individuals who were delegitimized by the collapse of previous regimes. But it seems to me, too, that there are several factors that could have the effect of enlarging this sort of alienated group by stirring Balkan nationalism, on which charismatic strongmen, of course, thrive and continue to thrive. And they include, first of all, failure to resolve the Kosovo issue, which at this point seems to be pretty much stalled. Kosovo has been recognized by 65 states, which is about one-third of the planet, after 2 years of trying. Indeed, not even all EU members have recognized Kosovo. The Spanish and the Romanians are concerned about their own minority issues and have refused. The Serbs, I think, have been quite effective in their policy in terms of stalling progress, but I'm not sure it's really healthy for the region or certainly healthy for Albania. So this is a potential problem. And then, of course, there's also the long-term stalling of European integration. The process of enlargement has, of course, slowed to a certain extent. We've all heard about enlargement fatigue, and certainly in light of the economic crisis in Greece and what seems to be a coming economic crisis in places like Portugal and Ireland, certainly do not encourage the French and the Germans to embrace the Albanians as the next prospective EU member. And then finally, there's also the deepening economic crisis. The region has yet, I think, to fully feel the impact of the recession in which we are in at this point, and this has always caused serious difficulties. One of my old Balkan history professors always said that an empty belly burns a hole in the flag, and I think this is certainly true for the Balkans in general. So the return, I would argue, of Albanian and Balkan strongmen is not inconceivable, but I would suggest that it's unlikely, and certainly it is not a cultural imperative. Thank you very much. I do have just a couple of more slides here to show you, give you an idea of what some of Albania looks like. This is basically downtown Tirana, and a fine example of sort of Stalinist architecture produced mostly during the Hoxha regime. This picture was taken in the 1980s and 88. As you can see, there's not one car, basically because of the fact that cars were actually outlawed. There were only about 2,000 cars in the country in 1988. And then in 1990, when the restriction was lifted, in a matter of 6 months, the Albanians imported 180,000 used cars, mostly from Italy, but also from Germany. So many of them were stolen. I mean, there was a great sort of fake travel poster in Albania, showed a picture of Albania and said, "Come to Albania, we have your car here waiting for you." but it did, it created a lot of trouble, basically, of course, because there was no infrastructure. I mean, there were no driving schools. People had no idea how to drive these things. There were no gas stations. There was no repair facilities. There were no roads. So an interesting 8 or 9 months. Again, this is downtown Tirana. Here's a nice, this is actually a picture that I took in 1988 from my hotel room window of that wonderful bust of Hoxha that I showed you here. It's about 3 times actual size, and it was ultimately torn down in 1991, and the protesters were sort of surprised to discover that it was made up of something similar to like paper mache. I mean, the thing just sort of exploded. Perhaps a statement on the regime. This is what the same square looks like today, after the importation of 180,000 cars. And this is actually some of the countryside. A remarkably beautiful country with a very Turkish architecture, of course, everywhere. Lots of mosques and traditional sort of overhanging Turkish buildings. This is Girocastro. This is actually where Hoxha was born, and there was a shrine to him there, of course, until his removal. Incidentally, Hoxha himself was dug up too in 1990, removed from the martyrs' cemetery and reburied in a small suburban cemetery. This is Saranda. Wonderful beaches on the Adriatic coast. Anyway, I have more, but I can show you them later. I think we're running out of time. But questions, if anyone has any.
Well, one of the honors that I failed to mention is that Professor Fischer holds the distinction of probably being the only IPFW professor that will ever be elected to the Academy of Sciences of Albania. And
that's probably true.
In addition to that great honor, we have a plaque for him, and I'm happy to present it to him.
Oh, thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you, thank you. Do I still have a couple of minutes for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I do have some time for questions. The punch is waiting. Pardon me? Oh, no. Right. No, there was lots of public transportation. So they had buses that transported people between the major towns and cities. In the villages, they had horses and carts. Absolutely. People who worked in downtown Tirana had bicycles, and they used buses. There was one railroad line, which basically went from the harbor, from Durrës to the capital of Tirana, but they used these old Czech trains, which weren't all that particularly effective. And the railroad line was basically destroyed in 1995, and they're trying to resurrect it now. But public transportation was basically sort of available, although, you know, it wasn't easy for people to move around much, and they really didn't. It required permission if you wanted to leave the village to come to the city. So mobility was not frequent, certainly. David?
I'm curious what type of education system they have there. Do people leave the country for higher education? Do they have public schools up to like age 12, 13, 14, 15?
Now or then? I mean, now there's one university in Albania. Actually, it wasn't founded until 1957. It was named, of course, after Enver Hoxha, but now it's just called the University of Tirana. But since the collapse of communism, a whole series of private universities have opened up. A lot of this, unfortunately, is basically for purposes of money laundering, and it works reasonably well. I mean, there are probably like 30 private universities in Tirana. They do actually give out law degrees, luckily not medical degrees, and they're very expensive. They're basically for the upper middle class. But lots of students are now going abroad for education, and certainly Albania has been sort of a target for the EU in terms of scholarships for Albanian students to European universities. There are lots of Albanian graduate students in the United States now over the last couple of years. The rest of the educational system, I would suggest, is pretty much in crisis, basically because of the fact that there isn't enough money being spent. And as the population increases, for example, Tirana, which when I was there in 1988 had a population of maybe 200,000, it now has a population of 900,000, and not one new high school has been built since 1990. So clearly there are serious problems. Yeah, Mark.
How were the borders of Albania determined in 1912?
Well, actually, they weren't determined until 1926. It sort of resulted from a conference in London, and the British and the Italians were the principal participants. The Yugoslavs actually occupied Albanian territory until about 1921, and finally they were convinced to leave by a series of major powers. But it was a major conference.
Is there anything normal or natural or rational about them?
Yeah, I mean, the rivers and mountains. I think the borders, to a certain extent, made little sense in terms of things like economics, because the people in the mountains had their markets cut off, in Kosovo, for example, which really sort of impoverished a good deal of northern Albania. But yeah, I mean, the physical features were used certainly more than ethnicity, because when Albania was finally formed as a state and its borders delineated in 1926, probably 50% of all Albanian-speaking peoples were outside of Albania. And this is principally because Albania didn't have a major power supporter, like the Yugoslavs had the French, the Greeks had the British, so what they wanted generally trumped what made sense in terms of Albanian ethnicity, which is one of the reasons why, I think the Albanian problem in the Balkans is probably the last major remaining problem. I mean, there are, Kosovo is made up of 2.5 million Albanians, and there are probably 400,000 Albanians in Macedonia, at least 60,000 Albanians in Montenegro. And although I don't think there's a real strong, greater Albania movement, clearly these communities are concerned with each other's welfare. Other questions?
Do you think Albania fits the model of a failed state?
I don't think so at this point. I mean, it does actually have a growth rate of like about 6%. But, again, we have to keep in mind that it started from down here. So 6% of nothing isn't that difficult to achieve. But still, things have changed. I mean, the industrial base that Hoxha created was basically entirely, the old Soviet Chinese dinosaur industrial plants, and all of those things have closed because they were a hazard to the surrounding communities and also produced goods that were simply not marketable outside of Albania. Since then, there has been a growth of some light industry. Granted that Albania's economy today is still very heavily dependent upon immigrant remittances and also crime. Crime makes up a rather significant portion. But it's sort of slowly shifting. And again, I think the European Union is very interested in Albania not being a failed state, as is Italy, basically because of the fact that if it does fail, the Italians are going to be faced with hundreds of thousands of more people in boats. It's 40 kilometers between Albania and Italy. It's not that difficult to get there. So it's really sort of in the interest of the Europeans to do something about building up the Albanian economy, and I think they're moving in that direction. They're having a lot of problems, however, because of the corrupt nature of the political structure, and 40% of the money that they pump in ends up in Swiss banks under the Ministry of the Interior's name or something. Well, I shouldn't point just to him. There are other problems. But no, I think a failed state a little bit strong. It certainly was pretty close to being a failed state in 1997. But now, there is slow progress. I think the political problem is still the most serious because it simply does not allow Albania to create a rule of law. And without a rule of law, there will be no investment. Who's going to open a McDonald's? Incidentally, it's one of the only countries left where there is no McDonald's, partially because of the fact that, people who set up restaurants want some protection from the state, and there isn't any yet. So it's a problem.
I'm wondering what you can tell us about Albania's process of joining NATO.
Yes. Well, this was something that I actually was consulted on and suggested that it might be premature. But I think the principal thinking here and the principal support that the Albanians got was from the United States. And the thinking was that this was, to a certain extent, one, sort of a payoff to the Albanian government, which has been extremely supportive of American foreign policy interests, not only in the Balkans, but in the rest of the world. I mean, there are Albanian troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And certainly the Albanian government was very supportive during the Kosovo crisis, probably 500,000 refugees were put up in Albanian homes for a number of months. It was very supportive in terms of the crisis in Macedonia. So I think part of it was sort of a payoff, and part of it too was sort of the assumption, which the same assumption I think that the EU made when they allowed Romania and Bulgaria in perhaps a little bit before their time, the assumption that this will somehow speed the process of reform. You know, they're now going to be sort of like us. Well, you know, what's happened in Romania and Bulgaria, with apologies to my friend, is corruption is still very much a problem. And indeed, to a certain extent, I think one can argue corruption really went up after these states joined the EU because there was so much more money. I think Albania's NATO entrance was certainly premature. But, you know, the opposition is sort of clobbering the government with it, you know, like, we are a NATO country and look what you're doing. So perhaps ultimately there will be a benefit. But I think that was the thinking, you know, sort of a payoff and then encouragement to do better. Other questions? Or is it time for cookies? Okay.
Thank you all for your
Thank you
attendance.
again.